Uh, Good morning. Hello and welcome to our webinar. I'm Onur Sultan from Beyond the Horizon International Strategic Studies Group, a Brussels-based nonprofit think tank, and I'm at the same time the coordinator of the Mentor Plus project, which made this webinar possible. With great guest speakers today, we will discuss mentoring justice involved youth. Mentor Plus project tries to build a mentoring program that will make difference and generate more positive outcomes for this disadvantaged group with many risk factors, such as beginning their mentoring relationship as an adolescent, having antisocial behavior problems, or going through many stressful life experiences. Today, I'll be your first speaker and I will give brief information about Mentor Plus project and its offer. I'm sure the project outcomes will be interesting for especially those in the field. To give voice to what research and evidence says and accordingly fine-tune our Mentor Plus program, we also invited two guests and they kindly accepted our invitation. Let me introduce them to you first. Our first speaker is Stefan Plaisier. Stefan Plaisier is a professor in criminology at the Faculty of Law and Criminology at the University of Leuven. Besides, he is director of the Leuven Institute of Criminology, or shortly LINC, and co-coordinator of the research line on youth justice at LINC. He teaches youth criminology and juvenile justice and research methods for bachelor's and master's students in criminology. His main research interests include the study of youth justice and juvenile delinquency. Stefan Plaisier was previously a McCormick Fellow at Edinburgh Law School at the University of Edinburgh and had visiting scholar positions at the International Centre of Compared Criminology at the University of Montreal and the International Institute for the Sociology of Law in Onati, Spain. He is co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Youth Justice of Sage Publications. Today, he will elaborate on juvenile justice, balancing between responsibilization and rehabilitation. Welcome, Stefan.
Thank you.
And our second guest speaker is Ronan McLaughlin. Ronan McLaughlin is a dedicated advocate for youth justice and enhancing attuned and special response to youth offending. With a background in social work and psychotherapy, Ronan has worked in the development of the first forensic child and adolescent mental health team in Ireland and in youth justice and mental health in Australia. Currently serving as regional manager in young persons probation with national responsibility for the delivery of probation services to children and young people, Ronan has a keen interest in developing mentoring programs in the youth justice space. He sits on the board of Lokele, a volunteer mentoring NGO working in the youth justice sector in Ireland. Today, he will recount his reflections on Irish experiences of mentoring in youth justice. Welcome, Ronan.
Thanks.
Yeah, and let me also please talk briefly about some housekeeping items. A recorded version of this webinar will be available afterwards. The link for the recording will be sent to your email addresses that you used for registration. In the first round of the webinar, I will briefly introduce Mentor Plus project in 5 minutes. Then our guest speakers will reflect their views in about 20 minutes. The last 10 minutes of this webinar will be devoted to a Q&A session. Please post your questions by clicking on the Q&A button on the top of your screen, together with who you address the question to. And please post them any moment because our speakers will also see these questions and they may address those questions during the discussion. So getting back to the Mentor Plus project, let me start my presentation. Yeah, can you see my presentation now? Okay, perfect.
Yes, that's fine.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So this Mentoring Plus project was funded by the European Commission under ERASMUS Plus program in 2022. And why this and the reasons behind this project is that juvenile justice system youth are among the most vulnerable members of society. And according to research, incarceration does not address their needs and frequently leads to harmful behavioral and mental health repercussions. Research in the field of, sorry, there are too many people entering, so sorry about this interruption. Research in the field of adolescent delinquency shows a positive correlation between, between mentoring relationships and increased social capital such as self-esteem, education, and employment and other achievements. Yeah. There are some of the research has kind of inspired this project. One of them is Lipsey and et al.'s research with the name Improving the Effectiveness of Juvenile Justice Programs. And the book that you see on the right side reflects results of meta-analysis on effectiveness of programs to rehabilitate juvenile offenders. And the meta-analysis covers 548 studies conducted between 1958 through 2002. And according to this research, for juvenile offenders in general, the juvenile justice supervisory apparatus of probation and court monitoring, group homes, correctional facilities, and the like, has at best only modest favorable effects on subsequent recidivism, and some evidence shows even modest negative effects. Second, deterrence-oriented programs that focus on discipline, surveillance, or threat of punitive consequences, on average, have no effect on recidivism and may actually increase it. And lastly, many therapeutic programs that try to build skills with the youth that are oriented toward facilitating constructive behavior change have shown very positive effects even for serious offenders. I will elaborate on that now. So this is a kind of representation of what the research says. As you see, the approaches that foresee a disciplinary approach or the deterrence-based approach has actually a negative impact on recidivism and the well-being, positive outcomes for the youth. Surveillance-based systems has only modest success, but the programs that promise the most are the ones that build skills with the youth and the counseling type approaches. And as the counseling is the most effective way among the counseling type approaches, we see that mentoring and group mentoring has the greatest impact among other options. Why group mentoring is more effective? Because it generates a kind of group dynamics within this youth group, and it kind of helps them to try to outpace their peers in terms of making progress. So based on that, Mentor Plus focuses on designing an intervention of non-formal education, offering the mentoring methodology to engage, connect, and empower young people in conflict with the law. And for this, the project objectives are designing and piloting a mentoring program for justice-involved youth in order to avoid their incarceration and institutionalization. Creating a handbook for the mentors to support them in mentoring justice-involved youth. Creating and piloting a mobile application to support mentors and mentees alongside the coordinators actually in real time. Supporting more than 60 juveniles at risk of deviant behavior in conflict with the law to reintegrate into society and have a life without crime by offering them the opportunity to contact with a role model, a peer mentor. Creating opportunities for transnational cooperation and exchange of practice, and between professionals and volunteers working in the juvenile justice system. And finally, establishing a committee of practices, which we hope this event today is going to help that in that regard, within the partnership and beyond it to support the project implementation and strategic evaluation and dissemination. So these were our kind of strategic objectives by writing this project proposal to the European Commission. We have three types of participants to the project. First of all, these are the coordinators who coordinate the overall effort, who makes the matching between the mentors and mentees, and who kind of monitors the progress among the youth. Mentors are the adults with a law-abiding lifestyle. We are looking at generally in terms of this within the context of this project, university college or university students who are trying to get a degree in psychology, in social services, or in basically in helping professions. And finally, the mentees are juvenile offenders or juveniles at risk of coming into contact with the law. The project started in March 2022, and right now we're in month 22, basically. As you see, as of 1st of February, we will start piloting the project. The project has 3 deliverables, mainly a program, a handbook to support this mentoring relationship, and application, again, in the same regard. All 3 are going to be piloted within this period. So our tier, the program, we kind of separated this into 2 parts. The first part is a theory manual, which talks about different approaches that are existent. And based on that, what are the positive sides, what are the negative sides, what could be their impact in the program that we're trying to develop. Our main aim is to develop a program which is going to be European, because the literature is prominently American, Anglo-Saxon, to be honest. The programs that are being in implementation, the literature, the research that you're going to find generally discusses issues in the Anglo-Saxon area. So we are trying to build a European kind of mentoring program that is going to address or kind of respond to the European societal context that is not existent, especially in the US. And then we made a kind of second section of this program, which is mentoring program for justice involved youth. And this program is basically depending on R&R and GLM models that we're going to be discussing in a few minutes. Professor Plaisir is going to elaborate on that, I think. And so this is the first, if you made the deliverable of this project, and it's nearly finalized, but we need to put it in a more kind of attractive PDF version. That's it. The second is the Mentor's Handbook. This is already finalized, and we have put it into this PDF version. It's an attractive form. It's going to be in all deliverables of this project are going to be available in 7 languages, because we're making our efforts in 6 different partner countries. And in Belgium, we have two languages, Flemish and Dutch and French. So that's why we're going to have 7 languages. I will come to those countries later on. And finally, we're going to develop a Mentor Plus application to facilitate the coordination and communication between coordinator, mentor, and mentee, which is going to automatize these meeting sessions, first of all, which is going to allow for secure communication between mentor and mentee, which is going to allow them to kind of give feedback to the coordinator, and which is going to automatize some of the things that needs to be done, and which are generally seen as a burden by the whole kind of system, the ecosystem, the mentors, mentees, and coordinators. So hopefully by the beginning of February, we're going to have the first beta version, and we will kind of add more kind of specifications to this as the time passes. This application is going to have 3 personas. So the coordinator is going to see a different screen than the mentor, and the mentee, of course, they will all see different kind of screens, but they will collaborate and coordinate this mentoring relationship in tandem with this, thanks to this application. Finally, we have developed a mentor training. I have put here some screenshots. It's live now at the Q&A session. If there's interest, I can show it. So whatever you see in this handbook, we have put it onto this learning management system, as we call LMS. So the mentors can go at their own pace and see different courses on different subjects, as you see a screenshot on the left side. These are presentations, but they can also go to as we call this, evidence review, the theoretical part of building skills with the mentors and so on. In this project, in Mentor Plus project, we are 9 partners. As Beyond the Horizon, we are coordinating the project. From Belgium, we have an organization with the name Stelter, which is extremely active in the Flemish side of the country, dealing with juvenile delinquents. From Portugal, we have Amadora Innova and Aproximar. From Ireland, we have INEP. From Italy, we have San Giuseppe. From Greece, we have Athens Lifelong Learning Institute. And from Romania, we have Visiumentum and EASI. So with these 9 partners from 6 different European countries, we intend to cover and address as many countries as possible and make the outputs of this project available for them. So I stop here and I leave the floor to Professor Plaisir, and thank you for listening to me. Yeah, please.
Okay. Thank you, Onur. I will try to share my screen with you. I'm out of the normal Teams application, but in the web version. So let me see if this works. Could it be that I'm not allowed to share?
Maybe we can do it like this. If you can share your PowerPoint with me, I will share it through the screen. And in the meantime, you can start your introduction and maybe we can do it this way.
Okay.
Normally, you should be able, but I don't know because you're a presenter now.
Yeah. So I'll just send it to you then.
Okay.
Okay. It's in the mail right now. I already start then.
Yeah, sure.
So otherwise I will try it again, but I've sent it through the email. So thank you first of all for inviting me on this webinar. As already mentioned, I will say something about balancing between responsabilization and rehabilitation, and I'll depart from the Belgium case. So I will make reference to evolutions in Belgium youth justice. I've quite a lot to say, so Onur, please tell me if I have 5 minutes left, that that I do not take time away from Ronan, and that we have sufficient time for perhaps some questions as well. My idea was to start with a very brief outline of the history of youth justice in Belgium. I will not take much time to do that because the final objective is to come out with a very recent reform in our Flemish youth justice system, which dates from 2019. So I will say very briefly something on what preceded that. And then mainly focus on the new choices that have been made in that Flemish legislation related to youth justice. And there, the idea will be to focus on 2 specific aims that have been put forward in that new legislation. That is, on the one hand, working evidence-based, and on the other hand, responsibilizing young offenders for what they have done. And I will conclude with some concluding remarks. So in the meantime, you can already see the presentation. Thank you for that, Onur. You can go to the next slide, which is the starting point. So we have legislation on children who commit crimes since 1912 in Belgium, which was the Children's Protection Act. It considers children below the age of 16, and you could say that legislation was the start of a welfare-oriented approach towards young people who commit crime, in combination with what we call in French défense sociale, the idea that the poor or dangerous classes should be controlled in a welfare-oriented approach, was quite central to that piece of legislation. Then we move on to 1965 with the Youth Protection Act, which was a typical example of the post-World War II ideal of penal welfarism. So it was, as can be seen in the quote below, an archetypical example of a juvenile justice system based on welfare protectionism that is recognized, for example, in the idea that minors are not considered to be responsible for what they have done, and therefore they cannot commit a crime, but they commit a crime that is defined as an offense. So they do not get sanctions or they are not punished, but a youth judge can take measures in order to rehabilitate young people, but he or she does not punish young people who commit crimes. However, and that is the next slide, this was not without discussion. So you could say that ever since 1965, there were some main lines of critique towards this welfare-oriented approach. That could be summed up in those 4 different critiques that are mentioned there. There was a doubt whether it's an effective system, whether that welfare-oriented approach is effective, whether it was not too soft on serious and repeated offending, whether it did not miss out on important legal safeguards. The best interest of the child does not necessarily mean that you offer children sufficient legal safeguards, and whether it was in compliance to international standards on that same level. And the question was also, where is the victim in all of this? So here as well, you could say Belgium is the archetypical example of a welfare-oriented system at that time, but it was also a fairly good example of the hesitations that are reflected in and towards juvenile justice developments in Europe on or during that time. So in the end, it resulted in 2006 in a reform that settled some of those political discussions and the critiques that were mentioned before. It reaffirms the welfare-oriented and protectionist approach, but it did add some legal safeguards and rights within the system. It adds also alternative measures so that judges have more opportunities to take on young people who committed crimes. And it also introduced a priority. Think about the idea that the victim was missing in the system, a priority for restorative justice practices. So the outcome was a rather hybrid model. You could still recognize the welfare-oriented approach, but at the same time, it had other elements, other models integrated within the system. Then in 2019, it was decided, and also part of the tensions, the political tensions that I mentioned. So Belgium is a complex country. I will not go into depth in that. But the idea was that perhaps it would be better to have legislation on the level, not on the federal level, but on the level of our different communities. So in 2019, indeed, the Flemish part of the country, so the Dutch-speaking part, the northern part of the country, created its own piece of legislation, the Flemish Youth Delinquency Decree. And that is the part that I will focus on, given that our research is also mainly focused on the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, the region or the community where also my university is located within. So I will not mention anything about the other communities and focus on that Flemish community. The main objectives of that Flemish Youth Delinquency Decree are mentioned on the next slide. And are mentioned at the start of the legislation and the memorandum of understanding that accompanies that legislation. So there was an emphasis on the responsibility of the young offender. There was the idea to work more evidence-based, to have also clear, fast, constructive, and restorative justice-oriented reactions towards young people who commit crimes. Also to differentiate reactions to crime from a more welfare-oriented approach to the traditional problems that originate within the context of young people growing up. An increased variety, even more so compared to 2006, variety of reactions becomes available. And the reaffirmation, you could say, of the idea that the deprivation of liberty should always be the last resort. I will focus on the first two because I think they interconnect to each other. So the main focus will be on responsibility of the young offender on the one hand, and working evidence-based on the other hand. Given this, you could say that this also ends more or less the typical welfare-oriented approach. So this new Flemish decree is even more hybrid compared to the reform in 2006. Moreover, you could question whether or not it is still welfare-oriented. It has welfare-oriented elements in it, that is for sure, but it's a further hybridization, you could say, around that notion which is new, around that notion of responsibility. Bear in mind that until 2019, within the federal legislation, we considered young people who commit crimes as not responsible. So now responsibility of the young offender is one of the first principles within this new piece of legislation. I will first say something about working evidence-based and then something about responsibility. And I hope you also see the connection between the two. So you can go to the next slide. Onur, this is something that I've mentioned as well. Yes, and this is some quotes from that decree and moreover from the Memorandum of Understanding that explain how evidence-based working should be understood and what can be the understanding of this principle. So the idea is that we gain insight into the impact of responses in relation to minors who commit juvenile crimes, that we work more evidence-based and that we create an evidence-based and user-friendly intervention database that could be used in policy and practice. That responses and methods should be used that have shown to be effectively in the intervention towards juvenile delinquency, and that therefore we should also focus on what is known from national and international research about what works. Now, this is not as such new. It is new within our legislation, but it's obviously part of a broader trend. I briefly refer to, for example, England and Wales and the evolution since the report Time for a Fresh Start, which also put emphasis on working evidence-based. I refer to the Netherlands, in fact, on an implicit or in an implicit way. Flemish legislation also refers to the Netherlands and the example of the database on effective youth interventions there. And broader within the field of criminology, this connects to that broader debate on rehabilitation and the reduction of recidivism also for minors, connecting to the older what works question, you could say, that has been raised since the 1970s in criminology. So you could say that the outcome of all this is that it connects to the idea of focusing on evidence and on effectiveness, which is also within this piece of legislation reduced, you could say, to the risk of recidivism and how to minimize recidivism. As such, it relates to risk factor research as a logical answer to that question. It's a convincing, at least for politicians and policymakers, I think it's a convincing logic and an attractive approach that indeed has been adopted also in how politicians created, for example, this piece of legislation. Now, you can also go to the next slide already. Related to that, you could ask some fundamental questions, and I will not go into detail on those. So maybe I will switch or leave out some slides, but you could question whether or not it actually works, that evidence-based approach and risk factor research as such. And a more fundamental question related to those methodological questions, you could say, is whether or not it is a legitimate and desirable strategic aim. Therefore, can it be justified in principle? Now, given the time that I have, I will not go into detail in both of those questions. So On the next slide, you can let it show to people, but it's not something that I will discuss in detail. If there would be questions on that, I would be happy to answer them. And also the next slide. So the first one was on, does it actually work? And the next one is on, can it be justified in principle? As such, the question is, or the answer would be, or my analysis would be, that risk factor research is as such an interesting approach, but there are questions to be raised related to that. And that brings me to the idea of working also around that other principle, responsibility, which is the next slide that you can show. Because if you only approach young people as risks and risk of offending, then you miss out something. And responsibility is connected to that in some way. So here you see some quotes also related to, again, the decree and the memorandum of understanding related to the idea of responsibility, where indeed for the first time you see that there's an emphasis on the responsibility of the young offender. There's also an emphasis on the surrounding of that young offender, referring to the idea that also perhaps parents bear some responsibility in raising their child and keeping them out of offending, you could say. And if you bring those two elements together, so both the emphasis on working evidence based on the one hand, and the emphasis on the responsibility of the young offender, you can see that indeed there's some kind of focus on the individual and parental responsibility, combined with that approach related to the emphasis on effectiveness, effectivity, and the risk offending and related recidivism. You could say that this is a rather negative, retrospective, or passive approach to responsibility, where the emphasis is on risks, on deficits, on individual failures, surrounding those risk factors, and it relates to the question, why did you do this, and how can we fix what you have done? Now, the idea is to perhaps also think about a broader and more holistic approach where you complement, and this is not to say that we should leave out that risk need responsivity approach or that risk approach that was mentioned, but perhaps there's also a complementary approach that we could connect to that, which is more relying on an active approach towards responsibility. So strength-oriented, forward-looking, giving young people perspective, relates to their aspirations on how to rehabilitate and how to reintegrate and how to become a citizen in our society. So surrounding the question, what is to be done? So it's much more future oriented. And actually, I left out the slide. Onur referred to that at the beginning, but I think it's clear that the first approach relates indeed to the RNR model, so the risk needs responsivity model, and the second approach, the complementary approach surrounding that question, what is to be done, is much more focused on the good lives model, for example, as one of the possible models to integrate also that forward active approach towards responsibility. So if you switch to the final slides, then indeed you could see here, this is to me, very inspiring book by Tony Ward, the godfather, you could say, of the good lives model, together with Chad Maruna, who wrote on desistance, for one thing, a very influential thinker within criminology as well, where indeed the positive elements of combining both the risk need responsivity model on the one hand and the good lives model on the other hand could be beneficial towards the rehabilitation of young offenders. And I see some resemblances there with what, for example, Stephen Case and Kevin Haynes also mentioned in their work on positive youth justice, which has some quotes on the the next slide, which was in my idea also very influential or inspiring work on how to rethink perhaps our approach towards juvenile delinquency related to those two or related to combining those two different elements. That brings me to the final slide. So I will conclude. So this was the reference to Positive Youth Justice by Kevin Haynes and Stephen Case. And then I have a final slide with some concluding remarks. So if you look from our Flemish experience, we indeed see that responsibility has become more important, that working evidence-based has become more important. There are central objectives within our legislation. As such, I do not believe that they should be disqualified as bad principles. But there's some kind of risk connected to them, and that risk relates to, as I already mentioned, the reduction. So a reduction to a complex, well, what is in essence a complex social reality, to an individual behavioral problem, to what is measurable perhaps, and to outcome rather than to output rather than outcome. So in that sense, I would, as a conclusion, I would also try to plea, given that analysis, for some kind of complementary, more holistic approach that combines responsibility and rehabilitation in also a more positive and active way. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefan, for this extremely informative presentation. I was going to jump in 5 minutes before, but you were so quick I couldn't jump in, so sorry about that.
I kept an eye on time, so I hope I did not took too much time away.
No, you were on time, really. So Ronan, I left the floor to you. Yeah, please.
Thank you, Bernard. Thank you, Stefan. It's really interesting, that discussion between tension between responsibility and rehabilitation. We're in the middle of sort of reviewing the Children Act at the moment in Ireland, and that's coming into the conversation quite a lot. But I'm just going to share this for a second. People see that? Hello?
Perfect.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Sorry, I'm just going to go. Oh no. Center view. 1 second. Sorry. Okay, so I'm going to really briefly go through, I suppose, an Irish reflection on mentoring youth justice. It's had a few years in the making, I suppose, mentoring as a practice in Ireland. But just before I jump into the details of what mentoring looks in youth justice in Ireland, I'm going to talk about the sort of context and sort of my positioning within it. So the Young Persons Probation Service was founded back in 2001, around the same time that the Children Act was founded. So the Children Act is the all-encompassing act that covers youth justice in Ireland. And sort of just touching briefly on what Stefan was saying, there's periods in Irish history where, I suppose, different practices have come in to youth justice. So from 1907, I think it was, until 2001, there was one act really which covered youth justice, and it effectively covered adults justice as well. So until 2001, they were dealt with in much the same way as adults. So the Children Act came in 2001. Didn't really commence until around 2004, 2005, but we've had this act in place for 20 years. So we've had a way of practicing, a systemic way of working with youth justice in Ireland. As part of that, Young Persons Probation Service was founded. So that manages all young people on probation in the 26 counties on the Republic of Ireland. We have 4 dedicated teams. On the map there, you'll see one in North Dublin, South Dublin, one in Limerick, and one in Cork. And there's about 17 probation officers in those teams. They're solely working with young people coming through the courts. And then we have, scattered throughout the country, we have another 15 to 20 probation officers working with young people sort of on standalone teams. The role of young persons probation, and I'm just doing this to paint a context as to how mentoring fits in Ireland. It doesn't stand on its own, it sort of stands within probation. It's very closely connected to youth probation. So across the country, I suppose we work in the courts, we work in the community, and work in detention centre. So there's one detention centre for the whole of the country, Oberstown, and young persons probation work from the courts right through to detention and then after detention. We don't work with young people prior to them coming into the court system. So I'm going to scroll on. Again, just to give practice context. So in Ireland, we've had roughly 20 years of the Children Act, 22 years of the Children Act being in place. Over that time, practice context has shifted somewhat. In the last 5 to 7 years, there's been a huge focus on youth diversion, so diverting young people away from the court system. So that means really there's been a decrease in the number of people coming before the courts and a decrease in the number of people going into custody. The last point there, I suppose in Ireland in 2022, it was 16,000 young people in youth diversion programs. So there are 107 programs around the country run by youth justice workers. And they focus on supporting young people that have come in contact with the police but haven't reached the point where they're coming before the courts. So there's 16,000 of those, and they're all allocated to 107 projects. Beyond that, so if those young people continue to offend, there's about 1,100 young people that have come into youth justice through the courts last year. So those 1,100 will be managed by the Young Persons Probation Service. So one of those 4 teams, or the probation officers around the country. So it's actually quite a high number of young people. It's around, I think it's about 0.4% of the population is coming into the youth justice system in Ireland. So it's something we probably, I think, are a lot higher. Certainly we're a lot higher than the Northern Ireland. Our colleagues up there have significantly less numbers coming into youth justice. So that's something we probably have to look at. In terms of the legislation, there is, at the moment, we're going through a phase of reviewing the Children Act. So they're looking back on the last 20 years and thinking about what has worked, what hasn't worked, looking internationally to see what's best practice overseas. And I think we are a little bit out of step with where practice is overseas. So I think probably the next year or two, we'll see some significant reforms in the Children Act, which will have a flow-on effect back into our practices. So yeah, as I said, the Children Act sort of encompasses all parts of youth justice. So it actually, while youth probation service comes in contact with the young person following the court, the Children Act actually focuses on them before they come into court as well. So it goes all the way from the first interaction that the young person will have with a police officer, the whole way through to detention and post-release. So it's an all-encompassing act, but as I said, it certainly needs updating. The relevant part for today, what I'm going to talk about is focusing on is section 131 of the Act. So back in 2001, there was a section written into the Act which is called the Mentor Family Support Order. This allows for judges around the country to make an order that a young person needs to be assigned a mentor. So that mentor will work with the young person for up to a period of 2 years. Alongside their young person's probation officer. So they have to have a probation officer if they come to the courts. So that would be the young person's probation service. But if the court makes an order in addition to that, section 131 order, the young person will have a mentor assigned to them. So the mentor will be found by the probation officer and will be assigned to the young person through the order of the court. So that can go for up to 2 years. There's very little by way of saying what that mentor should do with the young person. Really, it's around, I suppose, in the spirit of Act, it's around supporting the young person on the rehabilitation journey. But in terms of detail as to what they're meant to do day in, day out, that was left up to the probation officer and to the service that was providing the mentoring. So over the past couple of years, while that section was set up and founded on good grounds, and certainly I think was a really beneficial thing early on in the Act, it's rarely used. It's an order that's rarely given by the court. So the courts have sort of narrowed their focus to giving orders just around probation supervision. So previously there's, at the moment in the Children Act, there's about 12 separate orders that the court can make. One of those is a mentoring order. I would say in the last 5 years, oh, there goes the lights. I would say in the last 5 years, there was no orders made for mentoring orders. So the vast majority of orders made are for probation supervision orders, which give young persons probation flexibility to sort of work with the young person as they see fit in the community, to implement things that they see fit in the community. So it's quite a lot of power is given to the probation officer to manage that order, and that mentoring order hasn't been used. Now, that's not saying that despite it not being used in the court, it's not coming through the courts by an order, but we're certainly using mentors within youth justice quite a lot. Initially, with the foundation of that piece in the Act, section 131, the probation service understood that there would be a huge number of those orders coming out. So what we did was work with developing a community-based organisation to be able to support and provide mentors for youth justice in Ireland. That organisation was set up, I'm going to say, in 2004, and it's called Lacéile, which is the Irish word for together. So Lacéile, its sole responsibility, it's a non-governmental organisation, and we, the Probation Service, almost entirely funded through the Department of Justice, and their entire remit really is to provide youth mentors within youth justice. So that's their sole purpose, that's their charter, that's their business. So in terms of Lacéile's role, Lacéile is a national organisation, and as I said, not many orders, those Section 131, are coming through the courts, but us in YPP and Young Persons Probation link with Lacéile lots and refer Lacéile young people from orders that we receive from the court. So there's coordinators around the country in Lacéile, and we will link with them to provide mentors for the young people that come through the courts to us. So last year, I don't have the up-to-date numbers for this year, but from what I can gather, they're much the same. So in 2022, across the country, there was 152 young people mentored, and there was 250 volunteer mentors employed by Lacéile. Now I'm saying employed, but staffing Lacéile. They also moved into supporting parents of young people that are on probation, or that are in youth justice, and there was 94 of those supported last year. Briefly, you can see the stats there. I think the stats are showing that the largest number are 15 to 17-year-olds, and then next is the 18 to 20-year-olds. I think that's indicative of a point of, I suppose, youth justice now being focused much more on youth diversion in Ireland. So it's around keeping young people out of the courts as much as possible. So that sort of 12 to 14-year-old age group, they're not really picking up enough charges. They're not being dealt with through the courts. They're being sort of diverted away from courts. So actually what we're seeing is that number is dropping, but the 15 to 20-year-old group is sort of significantly increasing, and as is their complexity. So by the time they come before the courts, they've got huge numbers of charges, they've got really entrenched behaviours, they're very disconnected from services, and they're actually becoming more and more difficult to work with. So that idea of diversion away from the court system, while in principle has been helpful for a lot, for a small number, has actually resulted in them not probably getting the specialist services they need until much later, and until often too late. So the numbers there. So Lacéile will work with younger children of families that are involved in youth justice as well. So in terms of practice, I'm just keeping an eye on time. In terms of practice, Lacéile will allocate an initial meeting with the coordinator. So there's, I think, 4 national coordinators for Lacéile. The young person will initially meet with the coordinator. The coordinator will then try and allocate a mentor to the young person. Depending on the period that the probation officer says, up to 2 years. They will then begin, I suppose, building a relationship, setting goals with the young person, and there'll be ongoing reviews built in. Now, this is a really simplified explanation of what happens. I think there's 250 volunteer mentors. This is the structure of what happens, but the practice is often very different. So young people often, vast majority don't want a mentor when they start out. So there's a lot of building relationships. There's a lot of sort of not attending meetings. There's a lot of going back from the mentor. There's a lot of intensive work. So that's the sort of process and structure of the mentor program. In terms of needs profile, I think Stefan might have touched on this a little bit in terms of the growing complexity of young people in youth justice. I suppose this is what we're seeing in Lacéile. This is the needs profile done from last year around what areas of focus that often the mentor and the mentee will need to focus on. You can see the highest one is drugs, the highest number is drugs. Next to is mental health interventions and education. So despite Ireland's sort of booming economy, there's huge stretch in mental health services and on education. And they're not really being able to meet the needs of those more complex young people who have multiple needs. So what we're seeing is actually in youth justice, other services that should be picking up parts of these young people's profile aren't. And by the time they come into youth justice and by the time they come before the courts, those early interventions in mental health and education have either failed or not been in place. So we're really on the back foot in terms of trying to provide supports around that. But that's a general profile of the young people in Lacéile. In terms of benefits, so Lekela are very focused on looking at outcome measures. So measuring a young person's sort of views on things before they come in, measuring their sort of social scenario, measuring factors within their life that I think would lead to positive outcomes, and then doing a post measurement. And the key things for youth mentoring that they found was an improvement in self-confidence, communication, hopefulness, and engagement activities. So often the mentor will sort of handhold the young person into other services. So they might provide mental health support, they won't provide education, but they'll be that bridge and that support for the young person to connect to a system that they're really alienated from. So they're the sort of positive outcomes they find. In the adult mentoring and the parent mentoring, so that's parenting or mentoring for parents of young people on probation. The key pieces are emotional well-being and self-confidence, so improvement in both of those areas. But what I think probably is the one thing that government listen to, that policymakers listen to, is the social return on investment. And this is a really difficult thing to measure. It's so complex and interdependent on multiple factors. So I think this has to be taken relatively lightly, but I have no doubt there's a social return, a positive social return on investment. The last research done with Lekela said that for every euro spent, there's about a €4.15 return on it. The budget for Lekela is, close to $1 million a year, so we're saving, we're benefiting quite significantly, even if we put that amount of money in. The challenges, I think one of the challenges, and I'm coming to the Mentor Plus program quite late, but one of the challenges we've faced probably over certainly the last 10 years in how mentoring is done in youth justice, there's a couple of factors I've sort of noticed. I think alignment of volunteers and mentors between sort of young people who are on the extreme of offending behavior, and matching them with mentors who are often very well intentioned, but might come from very different backgrounds to the mentees. That's been a challenge of Lekela, and it's been a challenge in terms of getting them to engage. So that sort of focus on the alignment piece. Culturally, we were quite a, I suppose, homogenous society up until very recently. That's a lie. But we are becoming quite multicultural, and in that we're having difficulty at times in finding volunteers to match that multicultural need. So young people coming in recently from Ukraine, I suppose, a lot from Africa, from the Horn of Africa, finding it difficult to match mentors with those young people culturally. Slide again. And as I mentioned earlier, increased complexity for young people in youth justice. We're seeing multiple needs rather than one or two needs. There's 6, 7, 8 needs that we're seeing, and being able to address those as a mentor is quite difficult. Hiring and training. Culturally, Ireland doesn't have a very strong volunteer ethos, and it does in sports settings. So the Irish Gaelic Association, Football Association, would be entirely volunteer led from top to bottom. But beyond that, there's very little ethos in volunteerism, very little ethos in being a mentor. So I think trying to make that a cultural norm has been a challenge. Training people who work 9 to 5 Monday to Friday, providing training to those mentors, providing training that brings them up to a level where they can work with some of the most complex young people, I suppose, in Irish society. There have been some of the challenges. My final slide, just in terms of additional considerations. So next year and the year after, really, there will be huge changes, I think, in the Children Act, and that will flow down into how we practice and how Lekela practices. Some of the focuses, I think, need to be on probably mentoring youth detention. There is a program in the detention centre now in the last year. So there's a mentor based there, there's a coordinator based there who matches mentors to young people in custody, which I think will be really helpful. We haven't done the research on it just yet, but I think Lekela plan to next year. Early intervention as well. The Department of Justice here are focusing on, despite the age of criminal responsibility being 12, they're focusing on looking at how we might intervene earlier in young people who are sort of on that trajectory for offending behaviour. So they might be involved in criminal networks, with older brothers, with cousins, with the wider society. So you might be looking at 10, 11-year-olds as to how we can provide mentors for those young people. They haven't picked up charges, they're not in youth diversion, but their sort of profile says that's the direction they're going. And while we want to avoid widening the net to sort of grab more young people into youth justice, it's a sort of a balance and a tension between widening it so much that we pull in all these young people who wouldn't normally be involved, and sort of getting in for early intervention for those that probably will be involved. So yeah, another area I think that needs to be considered in the next year is young people in care. It's another aspect of complexity that we're seeing in the last 2 or 3 years. Welfare services in Ireland are hugely stretched. So we have huge numbers of young people in care, but that care is no longer what it once was. That care is now, you know, young people sleeping in hotels, huge numbers of increased homeless young people, and being able to sort of attune the needs to those young people and provide mentors to them while there's such significant chaos in their life. It's sort of a battle we need to think about, and a challenge we need to sort of try and overcome. But all of these things, I think, involve, like, the Children Act is one piece of legislation which covers youth justice in Ireland, but it's very much an interdependent system, and we're probably, you know, we're not at the start of the journey of including other departments, but we're not too far from the start in terms of trying to pull in the Department of Health, Department of Education, and other organisations and other departments, which I think play a huge role in justice without actually realising it. So mentoring, I suppose, to end, mentoring is a huge benefit to some of those young people it works with. I think it has to evolve its practice in Ireland, and I think it is evolving. Lacéile are evolving with how they look at how mentoring is done. And I think welcoming this a Mentor Plus program, I think it'll bring huge benefits to Ireland. And I think generally mentoring has a place in youth justice. It's just how we find that place in a sort of increasingly complex world. So I'll end there. If there are questions, fire away. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Thanks a lot. Really great points and great inspirations for the project too. So I'm passing now to the question and answer session. I'm also talking to the viewers. Please post your questions to the Q&A part if you have any. But the first question comes for Stefan. So the question is, you mentioned about this 2019 Juvenile Delinquency Act or decree in the Flemish side of the country. And the question is, how does it look at this institution of mentoring, this new act, and how can we kind of benefit from this extremely important tool in implementing this act?
That's a good question, since there's no direct reference in the legislation, of course, to the idea of mentoring. Given the presentation by Ronan, I did see some similarities in some practices that we have in the Flemish part of the country. For example, I think about JAR, Youth at Risk, which is a well established by now a project working with young people who committed crimes, and also having a mentoring part of the, well, it's a more complete intervention than that, but the final part of it is a mentoring phase where you have volunteers following up young people up to a year, I think. And there has been some research around this, because Youth at Risk is not it's not a Flemish program. It's coming from the United States. So there is some research related to that, referring to the same outcomes that were also mentioned in Ronan's presentation. So as such, there I see a connection. But to answer your question, there's no immediate connection or reference made to mentoring or to involving volunteers, for example, in the process of rehabilitating young people who committed crimes.
Okay, thank you so much. And this second question comes to Ronan. While developing the project that was already mentioned, so we had actually looked into this, the Becoming a Man program in the United States, where the central organization matches the people who have similar kind of backgrounds, so that they could kind of bring some extra values to the people, to the mentees. Then so when you mentioned about the cultural differences between the mentor and the mentee and how you match them, so I see the same problem there. The question is, what is the percentage of the mentors that are not volunteers, are they all volunteers? That's the main question to be questioned. The second is, now that you mentioned about this problem, how does Locale kind of act to kind of take action against this problem, this risk? Like, what are the things that you have in consideration? And yeah, please.
So the 250 mentors in Ireland, they're all volunteers. So they're all volunteers. They're managed by Locale has a staff of around 18, and there would be about 5 coordinators across the country who would manage those 250 volunteers. But the day in, day out work is done by the volunteer mentors. So it's all of those. In terms of the cultural piece, I think there's 2 pieces to that. There's sort of the socioeconomic culture, and then there's the, I suppose, classic version of culture, which is sort of country of origin, demographic culture. So in terms of the country of origin and that sort of that cultural piece, there's overtures made by Locale in the last few years into sort of refugee organizations that represent those cultures around Ireland to try and push in there and try and bring more volunteers in. That has had some success. It's probably had more success than the sort of socioeconomic cultural gap. So in terms of that, what we're trying to do, it's often mentors that have had offending behavior in their past. So it's an organizational risk to take on mentors that have had offending histories. So what Locale have had to do, I think, is sort of slightly shift their policies to allow to hold more risk, I suppose. That's been backed up by the Department of Justice. So the Department of Justice are looking to hire more people directly that have offending histories to work within this sector. So I think we're working in a policy context which allows for that, and Locale are sort of working with that. So it involves holding a lot more risk, I think, in terms of those people that have had offending histories. And culturally, it's around just reaching into the community and making the organization more flexible and open, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. We have one last question that comes from one of our viewers. Yeah, the question is, as you know, the target audience here, the mentees are at-risk group. And these are the juveniles that have made offenses, and there's a certain relationship between a mentor and mentee, and the coordinator stays out of this relationship, which oversees this relationship. So I think the question is, what risks do you see in this relationship between the mentor and mentee? And, in the past of mentoring experiences, did you have any kind of mishaps, any accidents, incidents in that regard?
Yeah.
This is a question to you, Roman. Sorry. Yeah.
I think the main risk is the boundaries. So understanding the boundaries and having good training for mentors around what boundaries are and how they should be managed. So I think if you have a really strong relationship between the coordinator and the mentor, that protects against some of those risks. But the biggest risk in the past have been lack of boundaries, and then things happening on the weekend, outside of hours, things that aren't known to the coordinator, reaching beyond, I suppose, their role, maybe into the family, and developing a relationship outside of their relationship with Locale and the young person. So first they have to know they're working with Locale, that it's not a personal, it's not them first and the young person, it's Locale, and they're working through that. But generally speaking, the training is really strong. The assessment of the mentors as they come in is really strong. So I think that you can avoid most risks by that. There'll always be 1 or 2 risks per year, but generally speaking, there hasn't been a huge incidence. It's been quite a positive history.
This is really inspiring. Stefan, is there anything that you want to add to this?
But not really. I think it's quite a complete answer. It does make me think about some other what works principles that relate to how, for example, it would be beneficial to find some kind of match on different domains between the mentor and the mentee. But of course, you work with volunteers, so you're not always in the position to match at that level that you might want to. Based on theory, for example. So no.
Yeah, I think the aim is, as I said, but it is difficult. I think they do aim to match along criteria. I know I worked in the Curry courts in Australia, and their Aboriginal young people were matched with Aboriginal people from their, I suppose, their tribe and their background in Victoria, and that was really successful. So yeah, I think there's a huge strength in matching those that you can align with rather than just sort of throwing anyone at the problem. But
yeah. So thank you so much for the answers, for your presentations, and for your presence today. I really personally, I drew great insights, and I'm sure our viewers have already drawn the same insights as I did. And we also thank our viewers for joining us today, and we wish you all a great day. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honor. Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Bye.